Games of Note.
Welcome to Games of Note. This is a podcast where we talk about games that have been historically important and why they're important. We don't necessarily talk about whether they're good or bad. We do that a little bit. But yeah, we talk about their historical legacy, the impact they had on game design history, and of course on our industry. I'm Will, I'm a game designer.
And I'm Wayne, and I'm a consultant.
And Wayne, where can people find us?
They can find us when we bother to post anything on places like Blue Sky, and allegedly we have a TikTok. I don't know why we have one of those. But we're on the various socials, so you should absolutely follow us, and you can comment on the videos that we're posting, whether or not they're good, whether or not they're bad, whether or not they're even relevant. But today we are talking about...
Today we are going to be talking about a game which I think is controversial between us. I didn't want to do this game, at least it's not this game from the series, and it is X-Men Children of the Atom.
Yes, so it's a 2D game that was developed by Capcom, launched in 1994, originally in arcades, and then 95 on the Sega Saturn. Loosely based on the comic book series Fatal Attraction, very loosely, but a lot of people mostly know its association with the X-Men series. So I think it's an important game for us to discuss because although it might not be as notable as, say, something like Street Fighter 2 or maybe even a 3D fighter game like Tekken or Virtua Fighter, it does a number of firsts.
Unlike Shaq Fu.
There have been lots of licensed games. It's not one of the first ever licensed games. But you've also got to remember at that time in the early 90s when we did get licensed games, most of the time they weren't that great. You did get some good ones, especially ones that came from Konami, so like the Simpsons IP licensed games. But the reality was that actually the majority of licensed IP wasn't great. So Children of the Atom, I think, kind of bucked that trend. So I think it's notable because of that. And also when we go into the history, you actually see, I think, a lot of love and care from the IP holders was really bestowed into this game. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's important. And then also it introduces a number of gameplay mechanics that maybe the average person who dabbles in a little bit of fighting games probably doesn't really care about. But mechanics like super jump is used in not only the most latest of the Marvel versus fighting games, but we see it in a lot of other modern fighting games. Things like rolling or tech. Tech is a mechanic that we'll discuss a little bit later. That was first introduced into this game. And it's also the basis and the origin, really, of the Marvel versus Capcom IP and series. And actually, you can make an argument that it has a Street Fighter character in there, so maybe it's the first X-Men versus Street Fighter game. It's not the first third-party crossover game. We did have Alex Kidd. That was the earliest one I could find. Alex Kidd in Shinobi World in 1990. There was tons from 93 onwards. But again, very notable in terms of the way that it did it and the quality of the game, I would say. So
yeah, I think it's worth noting here. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about like the crossover stuff, because for me, that's where this game is really interesting, about what that means in terms of like marketing, etc. I've done a bunch of research, and it probably, the thing that's really notable is this idea that it was from two different companies, and the idea that you're not just cross-pollinating your own fan base between, different IPs or genres, but there is two companies and possibly two very disparate fan bases come together. There was one other game that did that before, which I think nobody gives a shit about.
Okay.
It wasn't necessarily the very first. Well, we'll get to that later, because I got a whole bunch of research around that crossover stuff, because I think this is really interesting. Now, I think normally in Games of Note, I really talk about the game design side of this. And I think a lot of the stuff that makes this game unique from a game design is kind of quite inside baseball-y on fighters. And so I think, Wayne, you're probably going to have to help steer me a little bit through that, and that might be a little bit more collaborative. Yeah, but for me, that stuff, I guess, is like not knowing, and we can talk about my experience. I'm a very casual fighter fan. I played some of these games in the series, not this before. And you're a little bit more hardcore. You can tell me where some of this stuff came in and how it fits in that, sort of within the world, and how it changes the game. But yeah, for me personally, and this is the debate bit on this, is I think that the stuff that's interesting about it is what it represents in terms of that crossover stuff and where that went from here.
I think and I agree with that. I think that's probably a fair point. I mean, I think because I'm interested and invested in the genre, I feel that it has a couple more notable aspects to it. And for me, that's what makes it notable. And it's, again, we don't really talk about whether or not a game is good or or bad or not, or really even if we typically like the game. But having had the opportunity to go back and play this game over the last, I'd say for like 2 or 3 years, I've been getting back into it. I've really started to appreciate it more. And there's a term that we're going to get to that one of the developers mentioned about, I think, controlled madness or controlled chaos. And you really feel it in this game. And yes, when we talk about the mechanics, we'll try our best to not go too deep into the terminologies that exist within fighting games, because I don't think that really helps anyone who's casually listening to this. But I think the developers did a fantastic job of showcasing the powers of X-Men characters, but scaling it down into what is just a fundamental one-on-one 2D fighter. So
yeah.
We'll get into all of the mechanics bits, but should we kick off with a history?
Yeah, and I think that the rooted in that history element is the fact that this crossover stuff, like how did it come about? Like this was, at the time, this game, which came out in 1994, I don't think we've mentioned that. This was really new, fresh stuff. So Wayne, how did Marvel and Capcom come together?
Well, so they have a really interesting history. And I think the best way of doing it is to really talk about how the two parties kind of started working together and what inspired it. And actually there's one individual I think is really at the core of this. And I have to say, a lot of this research came from the Polygon deep dive that they did. They did an oral history on X-Men Children of the Atom. They did it for also a couple of other games. I highly recommend people looking at that. It was really useful in terms of creating a timeline and then kind of like finding other interesting bits to talk about. But the one person who everyone talks about as like the pioneer within Capcom to really make this game and the future collaboration, and that is Marvel and Capcom, happen, is an individual called Katsuya Akitomo. So he joins Capcom in 1991 as like a pixel artist, animator, graphic designer. And he's a huge fan of American comic books. So like the likes of things like X-Men. And he really evangelized it in Capcom Japan at the time. And one of the things that Capcom were trying to do was trying to reach a more global audience. And so they would try and create games like Captain Commando, of all titles, to really appeal to a Western market. But Akimoto-san was kind of suggested in saying that actually it didn't really feel authentic enough. And I don't know if you've ever played Captain Commando, but it's one of those games that it's clearly supposed to be based in the West, but there's something not quite right about it. And so, yeah, I mean, the idea of Akimoto-san's kind of wanting to work with Marvel obviously is more an authentic IP. So that was something that he was kind of like keen to do and to showcase internally at Capcom. Now, at this moment, Yoshihiko Okamoto, and he's part of the arcade division at Capcom Japan, they had an idea of partnering with Marvel, and it's not entirely clear if that inspiration came from Akimoto-san, or again, if it was based on just simply Capcom wanting to have more collaborations with Western-based IPs. Akimoto-san was obviously very keen in doing anything that was Marvel-related, and they did end up getting access and were speaking to Marvel about collaborations. And one of the first games that they worked on together was 1993's Punisher, which is like a side-scrolling shooting game. It's a really cool game.
Yeah, it's well regarded, right?
I think it only has ever been released once, and it was on this Capcom joystick. Yeah.
Which had the Capcom logo. It's really strange.
Yeah.
It was also the first release, I think, of Pro Gear, wasn't it? The shmup. The
Possibly. Yeah. So Akimoto actually ended up working on the Punisher. He was a pixel artist on that one. And although he doesn't consider himself to be the original creator of X-Men Children of the Atom, the game we're talking about today, he did inspire lots of other games, notably a game that's about like monsters fighting each other, which then turned into Darkstalkers, or what's known in Japan is Vampire. There are two other individuals who are involved in the creation of this game, Akira Nishitani and Akira Usada. Akira Usada, most people probably know him as Akiman. He does all the beautiful Capcom art, especially in the mid-90s, early 2000s. And Nishitani is the person who directed, Street Fighter 2, all these classic games. Both of those individuals, very well regarded, creators of Final Fight, creators of Street Fighter. They say they were also inspired by Akimoto's love for Marvel and the fact that he kept bringing comics into the office and was speaking to everyone about his love for it. Then there's also on Capcom's USA side, Alex Jimenez. He was also pushing for the idea of them collaborating with this Western IP, and they thought no better IP at that time to work with would have been the X-Men, which were quite popular. Now, on the Marvel side, it's worth remembering that actually Marvel wasn't particularly new to video games. They've been working with video games for a good while. I'm going back to 1982's Spider-Man on the Atari 2600.
Great game.
Sure. Is it a great game?
For an Atari 2600 game, for Atari 2600, it's pretty good. It's one of the better games on. Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot on Atari 2600. It's worth playing now.
Is that the same machine that had E.T. on it, 2600?
Yes, is.
So it's either Spider-Man or E.T. You choose your licensed game.
Yes. When you should really be playing BMX Air Masters, but there you go, Deep Cut.
Oh, is that Deep Cut? Okay, I don't know that one.
Yeah, fantastic game. TNT Games, an Australian company, actually. Yeah, if we do leave this in and you've got an Atari 2600 or you've got access to playing Atari 2600 game, go and play BMX Air Masters. You'll probably be quite surprised.
Surprised because it's terrible, or surprised because it's?
Oh no, it's really good. It's really
it's
good.
Legit good. Oh, okay. Yeah. What does it play like? Like Excitebike?
No, not at all. If you can imagine, California Games, the sort of half pipe bit. Imagine that, but actually good. It has like a trick system in it, which is, I wouldn't say it's like Tony Hawk's, but there's a system in there to do tricks, which actually is quite enjoyable. The sound on it is really good. The whole thing just plays really nice. It's hard to describe it without saying it is basically BMX Air Masters, but it's like, yeah, you do the annoying thing, which is the sort of the track and field, waggle the joystick back and forth, right, to go.
Yeah.
And then there's obviously only one button, but the combination of those things, it's somewhat intuitive, and you get to a point of being able to really nice fluid animations for the time. Yeah, you get to a point to be able to actually do stuff which feels fluid and flowing. It's quite enjoyable. So
is it isometric like California Games?
The projection is, I guess, it's oblique projection.
Okay.
If I was going to get technical about it, is that correct? It's a kind of side on. It's kind of side on, but like somewhat isometric. Yeah. When you're saying, like the Tony Hawk's GBA games, which were
isometric. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm picturing in my head.
No, it is sort of more side on, but yeah, it's a sort of similar. Okay. It's California Games like that. If you think about the half pipe in California Games, yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah, sorry. I was thinking of things like that GBA era, Tony Hawk's, and like I think even Jet Set Radio did something like that.
Yeah.
I guess the next point I wanted to make was around the fact that Marvel wasn't. This wasn't new to them in terms of working in the video game world. And although they had the Punisher going on with Capcom, they were still working with lots of other third-party game developers. So they were working with like Data East, if you remember them, who did Captain America and the Avengers, which was in 1991. And they were still working with Konami on that, the very well-regarded X-Men 4-player side-scrolling beat-em-up. But again, Marvel, there wasn't ever a one-on-one fighting game. So this was of interest to Marvel. And I mean, the one thing I just always think about in regards to Children of the Atom is they're all of these X-Men games are inspired by interconnected thing, which is the Konami X-Men game was based off this pilot animation or cartoon called Pride of the X-Men, which I think, and I didn't research this, but I feel pretty confident, has some ties to Japan because I think some of it was animated in Japan. But anyway, that pilot, Pride of the X-Men, was basically the precursor to the X-Men animated TV show, which X-Men Children of the Atom's sprite work and animation is all based off. So they're all kind of interconnected.
Yeah. And I think if you play this game knowing the Saturday morning cartoon, the X-Men Saturday, it's going to be instantly familiar to you. You're going to feel right at home with it.
And it should sound like that, and we'll come into that on a second. So just talking about like the actual core development of it, it's built on the Capcom Play System 2 board, so we know it mostly as the CPS or CPS2 board hardware, which was the successor to the original CPS1 board. So CPS1 had, classics like Street Fighter 2 and various other games of that ilk. And I think the first CPS2 game was actually another Street Fighter game, which was Super Street Fighter 2. So from that point onwards, Capcom was using CPS2 board. Nishitani is actually given a choice. So you've got to remember with Nishitani, he had worked on every single Street Fighter game, right? So he'd worked on Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Street Fighter 2, etc., etc. So he was then given a choice, like, do you want to direct this new X-Men game or do you want to direct Street Fighter 3? And he was like, I don't want to touch Street Fighter anymore. I want to work on this X-Men game. So Nishitani ends up being the director. for it. And he actually then ends up leaving Capcom after working on this game. But do you know what game he ended up working on after leaving Capcom?
Oh, it's going to be a fighter, I'm guessing, right?
It is.
Hold on. It wasn't SNK versus Capcom, was it?
No.
Okay.
It was Street Fighter EX.
Okay, right.
So he set up Eureka.
Okay. So that's the 2.5D. Okay. Yeah, I like that. With the Skull character.
Skullomania.
I like that character a lot.
Skullomania. Yeah, I like that character too. Like, I think he's amazing. But yes, so anyway, that's kind of the who was involved in terms of directing it. But really, also really interesting, and this blows my mind, is that X-Men Children of the Atom was developed alongside its sequel, Marvel Superheroes, right? So, like, just think of it, of creating like a big brand new video game where you're like establishing a whole load of new mechanics and such. And then also at the same time thinking, we're also going to build its sequel and all the things that we're going to revise on it. I think that's just, it blows my mind in terms of what Capcom was doing between 1994 and 2001. And we'll talk about that when we get down talking to about the legacy.
I mean, it does sort of, it blows apart that up. The argument of, people saying about DLC now, the developers kept stuff behind to launch it as DLC. It was always happening, Wayne. Alongside making this game, we're going to make a second better game, and that'll come out, following.
I think it released maybe a year or so later. We're not going to talk about Marvel Superheroes, but like I said, they were developing X-Men Children of the Atom, Marvel Superheroes, and then also a Super Nintendo game called X-Men Mutant Apocalypse, which I never played, but I hear it was good. So Akimoto-san, remember, he's the individual who's like really interested into Marvel. He works at JP. He ends up being the creative advisor and continues to advocate for this collaboration to happen. And he's even translating American comics into Japanese. What's really important for the team is that they really want to make something that is completely distinctive and separate to what they've been making previously. So they've just been known for really making these Street Fighter games, but they really wanted to lean into the mutant powers of the X-Men characters. So that meant exploring new types of movesets they haven't really seen before. Things like the super jumps that I mentioned, flashy super moves that take up, all of the screen. And this is something that really, I feel like, kind of sets the trend for the next set of collaborations. And there's this term that was kind of posed or coined that was this concept of controlling the madness. And that it needs to be like really flashy and really like over the top, but it still needs to be playable. Now, if you speak to individuals now who are into fighting games and they talk about this game, there is a term for certain fighting games that's called, and I hope I won't mispronounce it, but it's kusoge, which kind of translates to like shitty game. But they throw that term to games where it's not entirely balanced. Like maybe they're trying something quite flashy or something quite interesting, but it's not well balanced from a gameplay perspective. And I think X-Men Children of the Atom these days gets talked about in that regard. But I think that's important because I think that completely leans into this concept of controlling the madness.
Okay. I mean, I think this is an interesting point. I want to talk about this a little bit, about my experience with sort of like fighters. And I really, probably the fighter that I spent the most time with is Marvel vs. Capcom 2. I'm coming to this. So obviously that's like, 3-4 games later.
Yes.
That game really is the madness element of that. There's a lot more going on. And it also feels quite janky because there's sprites from different versions of different games and they're a bit pixelated and they don't quite line up. And then there's this 3D backgrounds that don't really fit with it. Like the whole thing, that for me felt like it was really thrown together, but it's incredibly fun. And then playing this, I was like, well, this is like a much more tighter technical version of that thing. But I'm guessing if you were sort of in the inside of it, it probably doesn't feel like that. But for me, coming to it, I was like, oh, this is much tighter. It's less chaotic. It's much more controlled.
Yeah, so I think if you're part of the fighting game community and you're really into 2D Capcom fighters, exactly the point you've made, which is they think of it as the opposite. Like X-Men Children of the Atom is a bit messy, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is the more refined version of the fighter of that series.
Okay.
However, I agree with you on this, and this is why I'm probably not considered that much of a hardcore fighting game. Like I like fighting games, but I don't know all of the technicalities around the games on a competitive level. But I think you need to have, I think that's what makes this game special to me, is that it's madness, but it's more contained. And we'll get into kind of like the refinements and the things that end up happening later on. But I think that the task of being able to distill the powers of mutant characters who, shooting lasers out of their eyes, or one of them is like half the size of the screen if we're thinking about people like Sentinel or Juggernaut, like just trying to showcase various like quite diverse characters and powers is a difficult thing to do. And for them to do as well as they did in this first iteration, I think is something like to be applauded. But I am getting quite deep into mechanic stuff now and gameplay, so I'll refine.
I think it's very difficult to get into that, and I think also for me as not a fighting game fan, the stuff about like power meters and stuff, I really don't know the intricacies of this. And my first thought coming to it is like, oh, this feels very much like Street Fighter 3 Alpha. That was my initial thought, and I actually, before doing the research, because I kind of came to the game quite cold, I went back and I went, was this just a reskin of 3 Alpha? But actually, it turns out that probably 3 Alpha was inspired by a lot of what happened in X-Men.
Yeah, I mean, Alpha 3's after this game. So Expansion of the Atom does introduce a number of power gauge kind of management. Like in Alpha 3, and for those who don't know, there's various, they use a system or many systems called the ISM systems. There's like 3 types of super moves gauges that you can use. And they're all slightly different and come from different types of games. Going back to Marvel and kind of their side of this, I think it's worth mentioning also, as we are talking about that controlling the madness thing, is that the game had these very kind of vertical stages, and you'll see that on most stages are either multi-tiered or are at least like you can jump quite high up on the stage. And
so that's things like floors will collapse and you'll fall into another part of the this was happening before Mortal Kombat did this? I think Mortal Kombat 2 did it?
Mortal Kombat did have multi-stage, but I don't know. See, I can't remember if that's only after you did a fatality or if you've knocked someone off. I couldn't remember if you knock someone on and off or the platform and then you continue fighting after that. Yeah. I don't know if you can continue fighting after that in Mortal Kombat. Someone smarter than us probably does know that. Or they could just use the internet. We're not going to do that.
Yeah, of course. And then
I think that they're not quite like what Expansion of the Atom did, which was you're fighting on let's say you're in I think Colossus's stage is you're in like a junkyard and then that gets destroyed and then you end up on a boat down a river. Like that's a really kind of creative, dynamic change that just hadn't ever been done before. So that's a great point in terms of like, it absolutely was seen and done most likely here first and done in a way that was, it didn't look jarring. And there was even, I remember, this is another fighting game, Dead or Alive 2 had multi-stages. And that was probably one of the first 3D games that had multi-stages. That's all been, I think, inspired very much from like X-Men.
So is it worth pointing out here then probably that this was a time when Capcom were realizing the need for production budgets and to increase basically the spend on a game, because something like that which maybe doesn't add a lot to the game, but it adds a wow factor to it. It's a bit of polish to it. It seems that was, I guess at this time, like SNK were probably biting on their heels. Capcom weren't necessarily the only or the best game in town anymore. There was a lot of competition in that space, and probably the need for them to be better than Shaq Fu was probably
which is
quite
tough.
intense.
Which is tough. I mean, that's a great point in that, like, were they increasing budgets? I wasn't able to see what the budgets were for this game. I'm skipping ahead a bit, but I do remember seeing in the research that when this game launched, Capcom Japan weren't particularly ecstatic with its performance, but both Capcom and Marvel were really happy with it, and especially as a licensed product that went alongside their TV series at the time. Got to remember that at the time they were looking at it probably mostly from the arcade. 1994, in terms of the arcade scene, there's a ton of fighting games. You're getting fighting games from Sega, you're getting fighting games from SNK. There's a lot of titles out there. So it's possible that it's very competitive. And maybe it just didn't do what they had expected to it because of the amount of work. I mean, I'll just jump to kind of the next part of the history in that, like, it was difficult from Capcom JP's perspective because they obviously had Marvel and they had 2 individuals who were really, it sounded like they were kind of like godsends in terms of making this project happen on that side. So Dana Moorehead and Justin McCormack, they were approving everything, every step of the way, basically. And what was happening, and you've got to remember, this is pre-internet, internet that we have now, at least. Designs, pixel art, sketches, this was all being sent by like FedEx and by faxes for people to like look over and approve. And if something wasn't good, they have to add a note and they'll have to send it back. Or it would get approved or whatever may happen with it. So a lot of back and forth happening. And there's one additional story, which was not too long before the game was actually completed. They had recorded some audio, like the voiceovers of the characters doing the moves within the game. But that was something that did get rejected by Marvel. They didn't like whatever Capcom had put together. However, Alex Jimenez and then Marvel's Joe Calamari were, I think the story is that Alex Jimenez kind of just picked up the phone to the folks who were working on the animated TV show that was happening at the time and said, "Hey, would you mind just like spending some time recording some voiceovers for this game and for the characters?" So that is how we ended up getting the animated TV show's voices in the game, which I remember when I was a kid and this game came out and I heard that it had the original VO. I was kind of blown away by that because I was a fan of the X-Men cartoon. And there wasn't, you've got to also remember at that time, 94, we weren't getting a lot of voiceovers.
Yeah, right.
Characters, right? And so to have like the little bit of speech and audio that we were getting and getting them from the actual people who were doing the voices in the cartoon, like,
which was a company Canadian? I think
they were Canadian, yes.
Yes.
That's
and it
right.
was like, they sort of said, "Oh yeah, we've just got all those people on hand and we can do it for like whatever it was, like 60,000 or something." It was like incredible.
Yeah, it was cheap. Yeah. It was a lot cheaper than, you think about trying to get a cast for a game these days. Like it's expensive.
Yeah.
That is kind of like the history of the game. So I guess we'll just fast forward in terms of its release. So the game ends up being completed. It arrives in Japanese arcades in 1994 and then worldwide in 1995. So anyway, that game comes out. As I said, Capcom JP, not too pleased with it, but both Marvel US and Capcom US obviously quite happy with it.
So
it then gets...
Sorry, to go back, because I think I asked this earlier and I don't know if I got the clarity on it. Is that to do with the financial performance? Because I'm guessing domestically for Japan, it didn't do great because maybe the Marvel license wasn't as well known, whereas in the US...
Competition as well.
Okay, right.
Yeah, I say it's down to also competition, but then also the fact that the US were happy with it because they had a licensed game that they can promote next to their TV show. And that, that's something to have to get the kids, to interested in the show. Now, bear in mind, I think the X-Men cartoon animated series was very popular. So it was obviously going to do fine by itself, but it probably doesn't hurt for them to have this game.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that TV show and I remember watching it as a kid. I think if you come to this game and you don't have experience with that and you're maybe into like the more modern comic books or you're into the films, so the Marvel Cinematic Universes, you not know who a lot of these characters are because I think a lot of them probably don't feature as heavily. Characters like Gambit, I think, is one of my favorite X-Men characters of all time, and he's not in this game.
He gets introduced in X-Men vs. Street Fighter.
Right. Okay.
So 2 games later down the line, but yes, Gambit was obviously very popular. There are some interesting choices in the game, so we'll get to that actually because that's a great talking point. I'll just end in terms of just talking about its releases outside of arcade. So it ends up getting ported originally to the Sega Saturn. This was done by a studio called Rutobo Games. I didn't really know much about them, but this is where we get to tick a box. They were known for porting a number of Sega arcade games to consoles, but they were also the studio who worked on porting some of the classic Sega games in Shenmue 2. So there should be like a Games of Note podcast. Like we mentioned Shenmue, we mentioned Magic the Gathering, we mentioned Astrobot, we mentioned Elden Ring, Castlevania. It's all circles.
Yeah.
So it ends up getting ported in 1995 to Sega Saturn and is published by Acclaim outside of Japan. Now, CPS2 uses 32 megabits of RAM and the Sega Saturn only had 2. So there was quite a bit of animation that was cut. However, I remember we used to use these terms like arcade perfect of like when a game would come from the arcades to home consoles. And this was as close as we ever had at that point to like a 2D fighting game that had as much of its original animation as this game did. And it had really good reception as well.
And I think looking into this, it didn't even use any of the Saturn RAM card, did it? And
It didn't.
Some of the
No.
some of the later fighters, I think, did use a ROM card as well as a RAM card. Yeah, okay, but this one didn't. Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah. So there were 2 other ports around that period. It was ported by Probe Entertainment to PC, and then I think they're the same team who also worked on the PS1 port, which came way later down the line in 1998, which would have actually been after Marvel Superheroes, which is this game sequel. That would have come to PS1 first before this game did. But anyway, this had even more animation cuts, and was considered to be like a quite poor port. Unfortunately, that wasn't back in the day the best way of playing it. These days, there are more, there's much better ways of playing it, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's its history and its original release.
So let's talk a little bit about how the game plays from a novice layman perspective. Although I've been referencing lots of Street Fighter games I've played in the past, I've never gone deep on any of them and never really been a hardcore player. It's a 1v1 fighter, so this doesn't have the sort of 3v3 that we see emerge in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, where you can dynamically bring characters in and out.
2v2 gets introduced in X-Men vs. Street Fighter for the first time.
Okay.
And Marvel vs. Capcom 1 has 2v2, but also has assists. That's one of the first games to have assists. But Marvel vs. Capcom 2 has 3v3.
Yeah. And there were some later SNK titles as well, which also did this. I wonder if it did it first. Was it Kazuna Encounter did?
Yes. Okay. I'm glad you bring that up. It comes out in 96. X-Men Versus in terms of tag specifically.
Okay. So these things, these ideas are coalescing around this idea of like, okay, well, people are maining a character. I guess that from a design point of view, right, that you main a character, you get really good at that character. How do you force people to switch up and explore new characters? As a game like Street Fighter has a lot of depth, right, across the broad spectrum of characters. And normally as a player, you're disincentivized. And this is a problem that comes up in like hero shooters. And when I've done consultancy for hero shooters, it's always a problem. Is it somebody mains something, but how do you get them to explore all of these other, strategies and gameplay because they get good at a thing? So I guess introducing that tag team thing, I suspect came from that route of, well, let's get people to play some more of these games, these characters, to go into more depth and adding more of those characters with different gameplay types. If you've got a projectile type or, the probably adding that tag teaming thing. So it makes sense that naturally people were stumbling upon these same ideas in the same way because it adds more depth to the game without you having to add more content necessarily.
Just to be clear though, the thing you're talking about now, you're talking about the tag.
Well, I think even with having rosters of characters, because
I see. Okay, I see the point you're making. Okay,
yeah,
got it.
Because as a super vanilla fighting fan, I know how to do Hadouken, so I just play Ryu. Maybe I play Ken. Maybe I play Akuma, right? But I'm not gonna deviate from that massively. Whereas going into Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is teaching me to do a lot of those other characters and how to play them. And so yeah, it sort of feels like natural game design that you have this problem of like people maining a character, and then how do you pull them out of it? And I think it just sort of it naturally rolls in. So again, we're talking about other games in the series and about the impact they had, because it's really hard, I think, with this game to sort of pinpoint this one and say, this is the game. And I think really what we're doing is we're talking about a broad spectrum, which goes all the way back to Street Fighter in terms of gameplay, the original Street Fighter, all the way up to, the modern sort of Street Fighters that we see now, right? And then all of the spin-offs and all the different genres that go into that. So yeah, it's also worth noting this is a 3-punch and 3-kick. So that is true for all games from Street Fighter 2. And I understand the history of this is the Street Fighter 1, which I actually happened to play in the world in the arcade as a kid, because it's a reasonably rare thing, and it was an awful game. It had pressure-sensitive buttons. It had one button and reasonably large buttons, which were one for punch, one for kick, and how hard or lightly you press that button depended on what kind of attack that you did. Now, the problem was that kids obviously would just start slamming their fists into these things, and they all just broke. So really, there were actually only 3 pressure sensitivities. So what they did is they just went back and later versions of the game just replaced those 2 pressure sensitive buttons with a 6-button system, which was 3 punches and 3 kicks. Now, this is getting a little bit nerdy on the electronics, but the JAMA connector, which connects the sort of universal connector for arcade cabinets, which connects the control panels to the arcade board and then that off into the monitor. It only has 4 buttons, right, which is what you see on traditional SNK fighters. And so there is a thing called the kick harness, which adds in the 2 additional kick buttons. Wait, nerdy, but a little bit of history for you. Yeah,
you're absolutely right, and I think it's worth detailing those additional 3 buttons, which the kick harness typically is used in Capcom games to give you those additional buttons, because the buttons are split into different levels of, I guess, of your attacks. So you have, typically it's named like light, medium, and heavy. So you have light, medium, heavy punch, light, medium, heavy kick. And so this allows you to do really kind of, especially in this game, quite different sets of moves. But if you think as something as basic as Street Fighter 2, Ken and Ryu, if you do your projectile, your fireball, your Hadouken, depending on which 3 of the punch buttons you press, that just determines the speed of the projectile in terms of when it travels. In X-Men of the Atom, while that's the case for some characters, for other characters, it might be completely different in terms of the attack move you might get. So for someone like Cyclops, it's a difference between him crouching and doing his optic blast, his projectile, him standing and doing it, or him doing it diagonally upwards. And that's really useful when you've got a vertical game like this. Yeah. So they really thought about this, the movement, the space, and how to utilize those 3 different buttons that they have to really make the game feel quite spectacular, I guess.
And I get this all kind of comes down to, like, when you're talking about this evolution in fighting games, is the thing you might come to as a sort of outsider is like, why? Why do they add all of this complexity to it? And the simple answer to this is that what Capcom were doing, their audience was not necessarily the players. Their audience was actually the arcade operators. And what arcade operators cared about was not whether or not you came out of it thinking that the game was good, but about how many quarters you sunk. So the complexity of these games, adding that element of mastery. And if you played Street Fighter and you really enjoyed it, and you talked about the fact that the next game was already set up in this series, and that added more complexity. It was about drip feeding that into players, and so that the hardcore would continually be pushing their limits of this. So if you go to any arcade in Japan that has a reasonably hardcore player base, you will see them playing, Dragon Spirit, some, maybe Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and there's still players there which are every day they're spending, hours a day working and sinking credits into these games because of the depth and the complexity they see. So any of the sort of these arcade genres that we touch upon, and I think we're going to probably do something on shmups coming up, you'll see this very esoteric depth of mechanics and them constantly switching up. I guess the counter to that is now, in a world where we probably have abundant supply of access to the game, right, through whatever method, for various ports, and this game I think has had some home ports to it. Those lend to people still getting really hardcore and really in depth into them, and they sort of stand a test of time, I guess, a legacy. But yeah, a super interesting point, I think, about like that evolution and where it all comes from. So we talk about this being a crossover title and it being the birth of the Marvel versus Capcom series. That is because there is one Street Fighter character in it, which is Akuma, which is unlockable, and it was part of the licensing deal. So how does that work, Wayne? Like, what was the purpose of the licensing deal? Were they doing it because they had to, it was a necessity, or was it about testing the water about this crossover?
I didn't find any research that suggested that when they first started making this fighting game that they had a plan of working towards a crossover fighting game. It's very possible that they did, but I didn't see or read any evidence of that being the case. What I more believe in, and we've seen this with other developers and other games, where you would have like a nod to the company or a collaborator, and in this case it being developed by Capcom, known for Street Fighter, uses similar kind of motion inputs, is what we describe Street Fighter being. A lot of that lended itself to Street Fighter characters, so throwing Akuma in there, Guki in there as an unlockable character, kind of made sense. And it being part of the licensing deal from Capcom's side means like they get to promote their Street Fighter character in this X-Men game. Which is funny because this is really nerdy, that particular sprite of Akuma is from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. So he wasn't the version that was from Alpha. So this would have been like his second appearance, I think, within a game, I think. So yeah, really interesting. And I love the point that you made earlier, and I want to go back to that regarding about kind of almost maining characters, this whole idea of who you main. That is a term that's used in fighting games still to this day, of like, who do you main? Like someone will ask you, who do you main in this particular game? You talk about hero style shooters and things like Overwatch and whatnot, like characters are quite distinctive and quite different. And this game has a lot of distinct characters. Colossus plays completely different to Cyclops. Cyclops plays completely different to Iceman. Iceman plays completely different to Sentinel. Sentinel has a whole different type of animation style. Like, he is multiple kind of sprites on top of each other. Not a technique that's really seen really elsewhere. There's one other fighting game that I know that uses that technique, which is this really obscure Gundam Wing fighting game that has that for the mobile suits. But really interesting characters, all quite different. We kind of mentioned also not all of the characters you might not have known. So, like, was a character I think in the animated series I saw once, and she's a character who's got multiple arms, kind of like alien looking character, but probably not the most well known. But I imagine this was something on Marvel's side, because I remember reading in some of the history that, you know, there was characters that Capcom wanted that Marvel said no to. And they wanted to push certain characters for whatever reason. So they wanted Silver Samurai in there. They wanted Psylocke. Again, a character wasn't really super well known. Like, a really cool character. She's the character I play the most.
I guess this kind of like leans into like the fact that X-Men, a lot like Street Fighter, is a roster. And you wouldn't have an X-Men game without Wolverine. And in the same way that you probably wouldn't have a Street Fighter game without Ryu or Ken. And, you know, I'm really into wrestling at the moment. And I feel like it's very similar to that you have. The thing that I find really fascinating in wrestling is trying to work out, like, what the creative decisions they're making. Why are they putting this character over, as they say, right? They'll put them in positions where there are certain talents called enhancement talents, which they lose against. And it's about putting those people forward and making them look good to see how it reacts with the character. And if they get, you know, over, as it's known in the parlance of, I've realized the other days I'm a smark, which is in wrestling terms, which is a smart mark, someone that understands that wrestling is fake, but is and still buys into the storylines, but is interested from like the creative angles and the sort of like the production element of it.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I find wrestling, if you can get over the idea of like kayfabe, like the idea that the whole thing is about pretending that this is a world where everything is true and real, it's a real sport, and you start to embrace it for sort of like what it is. Incredibly fascinating. But yeah, you're still into this idea of like roster characters and who you're promoting, and X-Men has that, Street Fighter has it, and you know, it's always bringing new characters to the fore and pushing them and seeing what happens with them. So, yeah, that makes total sense. And I guess also maybe for Marvel they didn't. The thing that's interesting about the later games, I think, for me, is this sort of crossover element, and we're going to get into this a lot. It's like, if you're a casual player coming into the arcade and you don't know what Street Fighter is, but you watch X-Men on Saturday morning cartoons, maybe you're a little bit younger than the typical. It's fantastic that there's this game here for you, right? Like the Simpsons did this, the Konami Simpsons game was brilliant. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, those two beat-em-ups, fantastic games, did that licensing thing. And they probably brought a new generation into the arcades. But then if you're an existing arcade player and you come in and you see this X-Men game, it doesn't necessarily have any, because Akuma's an unlockable character. You're not necessarily drawn to that. But when you get to that point of it being crossover, you're cross-pollinating both audiences, right? Because you're pushing to the Street Fighter players, hey, there's this X-Men, all these like fun characters. I think that's the sort of like the brilliance of it, which comes up later. So anyway, we've talked a little bit about how it plays. The game design, I'm going to run into a little bit of this, and I think, Wayne, you're probably going to need to guide me on it. It does have all new sprite work, and I think that's the thing that you probably notice at it, coming from other games. If you were playing Street Fighter 2, that much... This is probably the first game where you're seeing like this really consistent, higher resolution, more frames of animation.
Yes, I guess in terms of making the use out of CPS2, I think Vampire/Darkstalkers is another contender that, you know, beautifully animated still to this day. I think I know some folks who are into sprite work, and they consider Darkstalkers on the same level as Third Strike or the Street Fighter 3 series in terms of just how immaculate it is. But I also would throw this game in, and no one else can see this apart from myself and Will, but in our little doc where we have things, I put some of the animations, some of the GIFs of the characters, because to this day, I still think they are phenomenal. Seeing some of the characters in terms of how they move, how some of them are breathing in their idle stance, like you just didn't see games that would do things like this. Like, it's just absolutely phenomenal.
Looking at the pec muscles on Cyclops there, and they're very jiggly.
They're jiggly, right?
probably not true of all the characters. But also, if you were coming from like those Saturday morning sort of cell animations, that they were reasonably low frame rate, and they didn't have that same level of fidelity. That even though the storylines on those things were great, they were reasonably cheaply animated, right? So this felt probably for a lot of X-Men fans quite luxurious, because we're still many years off the first X-Men film.
Yes, the first X-Men film's like 2000, 2001. So something, yeah, quite a while away.
Yeah. So let's go a little bit into the mechanics. So it has this combo system, and there's this ability to sort of chain attacks in a way that you probably couldn't do before. And it also, it's reasonably button mashy, right? So I noticed with Cyclops, if I did the sort of Hadouken style move, that would launch a character, and then I could, chain a couple of moves, including his sort of laser blast as well. And so that felt really nice. I think even coming from this as a sort of semi-button masher, the sense that combo system was there, and it kind of worked. And it lended itself to that juggling. I know if you're probably quite deep into fighters, that probably the combo juggling system feels quite basic in comparison to latest, but for me it was somewhat accessible, so I thought that was really, really interesting. Introduces the super jump, which is sort of like a double jump, and it gives that additional height. So effectively you're playing, and this is I think very classical across all of the Marvel vs. games, is that idea that you're fighting on two levels, which is on the ground and in the air, which is maybe less true in a lot of the standard mainline Street Fighter games. That's not so much of a okay.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And then there's also evasion, which is roll and jump. I was interested in this because I know that King Fighters did rolling and evasion. Did they do it first?
So being able to roll, having been knocked down, I think that was something that was kind of quite new to the space. You kind of mentioned about kind of obviously the super jump is really important, and being able to fight people in the air, as you say, that was definitely something that game introduced. To roll from being knocked down or being knocked back is really useful, because it's sometimes, especially if the game is considered, and I'll use that term that I used earlier, gay style game, where it can be a bit cheap. Sometimes that, if you think of a character like Omega Red in this game, he can grab you, he can throw you up in the air, he can grab you again, he can throw you on the ground, and then you do your X ability, which we'll talk about in a second. You also get hurt from actually hitting the floor in this game, which is also quite unique. So there's like floor damage. So yeah, I mean, whether or not I feel that X-Men is the one that really kind of was able to implement these all in a consistent way. And for me, that's why I feel like a lot of the abilities that it's introduced are really done best here.
Interesting. Okay. And then I guess we get into the power gauges, and this is something that I never really understand the subtleties of.
Sure.
Wayne, can you explain this to me like I'm 5?
I can try my best to explain it. Yeah. So basically you have a super meter, which they call the X power gauge. And this meter goes up every time you kind of hit someone, or if you block an attack, depending on whatever is going on in the actual match, this meter is constantly going up. And there are kind of 2, maybe 3 levels to your meter in this game. And so depending on what you're doing, and depending on what attack you're doing, especially if it's an EX attack, that might use some of your power gauge. So they call it an X ability here. Games later on in the series, they call it like your EX attack, and you'd normally activate it by pressing 2 buttons as opposed to just 1 to do your Hadouken or whatever it may be.
And do all the characters have one of those?
So they do all have an X ability, and this is the other thing you would main one character and get really good at it, is that everyone is very different. So characters like Storm can fly. I think Sentinel can also fly in this game. That uses a portion of your X power gauge, so that's using your X ability. So it doesn't use your full meter, just uses a little bit of it. If you're Wolverine, you can actually, and this is a real like cheap thing, you can recover your HP by doing his X ability move.
So it's
quite different.
I'm going to say at this point, right, I am already completely bewildered by that definition. I don't think that's your problem. I don't think you're explaining it poorly. So at this time, how were people finding information about this? Was it just purely discovery and word of mouth? Because we're sort of early days of internet, so maybe there were people on proto forums, there were Usenet groups. Maybe, I don't know what year, GameFAQs was maybe beginning around this, right? But where were people discovering this? Because you couldn't go out and buy a guide generally for arcade games, right?
So great point. So you could buy a guide. So okay. Capcom was always they would always do like a player's guide. And sometimes it would also be unofficial. So there's a company called Mook. I don't know if you ever came across like a Mook. They're basically like, they will cover a particular game in all intricate details. So that's something you would do if you're really hardcore into it. But if you're not that hardcore into it and you want to just know the basics of playing this game because you wouldn't, you're at the arcade, this is where your information on your arcade cabinet comes in, right? So on the arcade cabinet, you have these things, we call them art assets, but they would be on typically if it's either a dedicated cab or the person at the arcade has put the right information out. You should have like a spine in front of you that's got all the characters' moves, but also some of the breakdowns of how the core mechanics work. So it should be explaining the X ability. It should be explaining like the HyperX combos that we'll come onto a bit. It should be telling you in terms of like what buttons you pressed to get out of a fall, so techs or technicals. But that's primarily the way you learn these things. But this was all happening in an arcade. So this is where the arcade scene comes in. And this is where you would trade, tips and tricks with your fellow players, whether it's someone you know, most likely it's someone you don't know you're playing. Someone does something really flashy against you and you're like, how did you do that? And that's when you would have shared that information. So this is like when we all used to speak to each other and were quite social.
This is maybe slightly different because it was single player. In shmups, particularly in Japan, you would find that top players would create videos, and they might even be like testers of the game early on, and they would get early access to the game. They would create these videos that they would then resell. Is that happening? Are people taping stuff? Is the competitive scene like evolution happening?
Yes.
Like,
yeah.
What's going on there?
Even then, there was a competitive scene, and there are VHS tapes of like some of the earliest, what people would call now as esports, but like competitive tournaments, of like tournaments, local matches, etc. They're being recorded and they might be traded via VHS. I remember I was just this week, I came across a VHS video from X-Men versus Street Fighter, like a very early days, like competitive tournament that is, you can pick up if you really want to spend a lot of money on that VHS tape and if you've got a player. But yeah, like this is where you would learn to get better. Like this is the original Get Good, but like by conversing with your fellow player.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the reference to Elden Ring. It's the idea of like you're generating communities through these games, through them being oblique, right? Them having depth and then not necessarily being very clear about what that depth is, and there being that element of discovery. And I think like, lore discovery in Elden Ring, we see it in almost any game that has a deep community, probably because of some sort of exploratory type in the Bartle theory of game design, which is the idea that you've got killers, socializers, explorers, and achievers. And the idea that in traditionally in MMO types, that relates to the world, right? That you explore the world. But I think that in my own interpretation of it, there's another way that you can look at it, which is like exploring lore, exploring movesets, or exploring the mechanics of the game, and then socializing to share those things. And so even if it's sort of happening outside of the game rather than being explicit inside of the game, and again, another reference happens a lot in Magic the Gathering, this stuff is all sort of coming back through, and it's kind of like communities revolving around these games and people individually finding their own fit. Even if you're not necessarily the person that is the best player of that game, you might be the one that's best connected and the people, and you're the person that takes the VHS from one person, or you share the tip. Or you might be the person that explores these mechanics, even if you're not the best person to execute them. And again, that happens in like the speedrunning community, where people find exploits and then they share that, and then the top runners will spend the time trying to work out how to do that and how to do it the most efficiently. So
100%.
Yeah.
Very recently, in the last like 2 or 3 years, a streamer was playing Metal Gear Solid and was trying to do like speedrun through it. And this is a game that is almost 25 plus years old. And they discovered just randomly on stream, they found like a new way of like cutting, 5 minutes off the time or something ridiculous. And then the community kind of jumped on that. And that's now become like an established tactic. I mean, and coming back to this game, like I recently was playing this and discovered a moveset for Psylocke that I had no idea. I'm sure most people knew about it, but there's a move where you can do her projectile, and if you hold back and punch, as soon as she throws her projectile, she'll jump backwards, and that means that you can get in close, you can attack, and then you can pull the way back, and you can be really tactical and strategic about your approach. So yeah, there's tons of discovery that's through the community. And just, I guess, the last thing we should talk about in terms of the X gauge, power gauge, is the HyperX, the super combo. These are the biggest, flashiest moves that you'll have. And these unleash like a huge amount of damage to the players. Depending on some characters, they are, this it can take away half of your life, if not a little bit more. I mean, this one's really kind of showcases each character's abilities and powers. Spiral, for some reason, can change into every single character and hit you. Like, that's her special move. Cyclops is his huge kind of mega optic blast. Wolverine has his Berserker Barrage. Like, all of these kind of like, some of them are quite iconic movesets all started in this game.
I mean, one thing I thought was quite interesting was like the Cyclops Mega Optic Blast, which there's actually agency within that super, which you don't get in a lot of the others, right? So the ability to direct the beam, which normally you kind of like, you lock into that move. And there was even within that was kind of a little bit of techiness, which kind of, again, is like another layer of depth. And it's always adding this depth to the game. So I guess you could probably spend a lifetime researching and playing this game. So there's an interesting question I've got around this, Wayne, which is like, this game I don't think is necessarily well regarded generally. So I found it was quite hard to go and find information about it. And the information I found around the characters and the movesets was quite lacking. It certainly wasn't at the depth that I would expect of a sort of Marvel or mainline Street Fighter game. So is that the case? It's just sort of like it's maybe not as well documented. There's less there. Is there room for people to explore on this game and find things that perhaps others wouldn't?
I mean, I would say that there is a lot of documentation around the game in that, like I said, there was a complete guide for it that was created. The website that is always useful, Fighters Generation, they go in quite deep in regards to the game. Fighters Generation covers lots of fighting games and will come up with like a target combo or a set of, or an infinite combos that you can continue indefinitely and kill your opponent. Yeah, there's a huge amount of resources and interest around the game. I think my stance on this, and I guess we'll be coming on to Legacy not in a bit, but I find this game got overshadowed. And I don't want to go into this point right now, but the reality is that you have Marvel Superheroes that launches not long after this. You have X-Men versus Street Fighter. You have Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter. You have Marvel vs. Capcom, and then you have Marvel vs. Capcom 2. You've got like a succession of titles, and everyone typically is jumping from one thing, from the old game to the new game, right? And if the last game really in that ilk, we did have Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but it's quite different to these 2D sprite versus games. People latched onto Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And so what I think ended up happening was people spent a lot of time on that. I know I did when that was available on Dreamcast. Like that was my favorite Capcom like fighting game for a good while, until I would say maybe 10 years ago, and that changed. But I think what's happened is it's kind of like, I don't know, revisionist history, so to speak. Or like, it's not to say that it's not good and that it's not important, but it kind of got overshadowed by its sequels.
Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy then. Let's get into this. And I think for me, this is where and this is not really game design stuff, but this is maybe more marketing. I think for me, this is where stuff gets really interesting. I think also maybe, Wayne, where you chose this game, because I know you come from a biz dev background, right? And the relationships and how companies come together is a big part of what you do and your interest in games. So this game is a crossover, only just, right? The inclusion of Akuma, and whatever reason, and whenever I saw research on this, people talked about it being a technicality of the license, but they didn't explain for what reason it was a technicality of the license. And I do wonder if it was sort of them, from Capcom's point of view, them trying to claim a bit of ownership over it, that this is our game as much as it is your game, or if it was dipping a toe into like what happens if we put these things in together. So it starts the idea of a crossover and two brands coming together, and it was a very, very early example of this, if not the first example. I think there is an example of two companies' IPs coming together in a game before this.
Yes,
which actually is Battletoads and Double Dragon in 1993, so the year before. But I don't think that's relevant because, I mean, number one, who gives a shit about either of those IPs? This is not Marvel and Street Fighter, right, which is two juggernauts. This is, it's two games. I know people love Battletoads and Double Dragon. People love Double Dragon, right? But
people do like Double Dragon. Yeah,
it's not the
same.
But
I know you're making a joke.
It's not the same level, am I? Yeah,
it's not.
Yes, it's not the same thing. So, and also this went on to spawn a huge series of games. The thing that's nice about this, and we touched on this earlier, is the idea of bringing two fandoms together. So if you're a Street Fighter fan and there's a new game now which has X-Men, and then later that becomes the whole Marvel universe, what you're saying is like all Capcom fans. So when you get to the point of like Marvel versus Capcom, you're saying it's not the IPs or an individual entity or license, it's a whole world, and these two worlds, you're lumping yourself together. And for Capcom, And I guess for Marvel, they're attaching themselves to a little bit of the magic of each of these things. It's sort of like they're validating. I'm a real big fan of hip hop, and particularly UK hip hop. And there was a time where, it's maybe like 5, 6 years ago, where every grime album came out, and you would listen to it, and you think this is absolutely banging, and there'd be an Ed Sheeran track on it. I do think this stands out for being particularly shit for two reasons. Just like Ed Sheeran can't rap, right? And he sounds awful on a beat, and it's sort of like, well, why have they done that? And I don't think it was a case of that they made good songs. I think it was a case of Ed Sheeran being hugely popular. You're all of a sudden going to bring this audience. And I think for Ed, he was getting a little bit of cool, right? Because he was, if he's on a Stormzy album, if he's on a Gets album, right, those people are legitimately cool, and they're seen within the culture as being cool. Ed Sheeran is not considered as cool. I don't think there's that disparity there, but I think what it was, it's about, and you see this all the time now within music, and particularly hip hop, the feature is so important. And I got my Spotify Wrap this year, and my top listen was Tyler, the Creator, and he had an album called Chromacopia, and there were two songs on there. One was Lola Young, and the other one was Doechii. And I loved both of those albums. And it happened, I don't know if it was from listening to Tyler, the Creator, that I ended up with Doechii and with Lola Young, or if it was from listening to them, and that they all, but somehow he had two features on that album, which led me into and became fans of those. And there was sort of this cross-pollination. I don't know where it began and end. And so you see this all the time now. It's really common in lots of media. Magic the Gathering, so it's going to be the second discussion of this. It's like they have this universes beyond in Magic the Gathering, but they basically bring IPs to Magic the Gathering. So they've done Lord of the Rings. They did Doctor Who. And you actually know what the fourth... So the first one was Walking Dead, Stranger Things, and then the third one was Arcane. The fourth one was, what was it? Street Fighter, yeah. So really early on, Capcom were doing this with Magic the Gathering. So this idea, and then, for me, it brings that audience of people that are interested in Magic and now brought into the Final Fantasy universe, which is a big one they recently did. And if you're a Final Fantasy fan, there were a lot of people I knew that from within the games industry which love Final Fantasy, that all of a sudden were discovering Magic because they were going and buying these cards. And then they were getting kind of drawn into that world. So the idea that that's a sort of a cross-pollination. And I tried to think about, can I think of examples going back outside, this happening outside of games? And I happened to be reading quite recently Judgment Over Gotham, which I'm a big fan of Batman. I'm also a big fan of Judge Dredd. And that was a crossover. It is Judge Dredd and Batman basically getting swapped between dimensions. And so Judge Dredd goes to Gotham and takes on Scarecrow. And Batman comes and takes on Mean Machine in the Meg City one. And that came out in 91.
3 years before.
3 years before, yeah. And then DC and Marvel did a crossover in 1996. So the idea of sort of, and I guess that this can work really well with comic books, is the idea, and also with Magic the Gathering, these idea of like having very flexible universes. You're introducing the idea of multiverses. You've got different dimensions. There's constant resets. Nobody ever dies. Nobody ever, this idea that you can be really malleable in those IPs. And then in doing that, you're expanding your horizons of marketing. So it makes a lot of sense from a marketing point of view, but it's given rise by the flexibility. And I guess like Street Fighter itself doesn't have a very strong narrative, right? There's not a very sort of like base narrative. It's quite loose. So the idea of being able to do that with those properties, and then also later on, you bring Darkstalkers and other Capcom IPs into it. And then the same with Marvel, you're starting to cross those things over. So the pinnacle for this, and so those were the early examples. And I started to think about, this is going to be another one for your Games and Note bingo card, is like, what is the best recent example of that? And that is my favorite game of the last few years was Astro Bot, which is when you've got this new character, this new IP, how do you make people care about it, right? In an oversaturated market as games. And the answer is you take all of the best IP that everybody's loved for the last 20 years and put all in one game. And that is what Astro Bot is, right? It's like every PlayStation game from the last 5 generations, which is all smushed into one. And there's references throughout for the hardware. And it's a multiverse IP crossover, which would it have happened without this game? I'm not saying it wouldn't have, but this is probably the genesis of that idea, right?
Especially, I would say so in the video game world, where we're talking about crossovers, and you don't get to X-Men versus Street Fighter without X-Men Children of the Atom. I remember first hearing and seeing X-Men versus Street Fighter at an arcade, thinking it was a mod. So you've got to remember back in the day, like when Street Fighter 2 came out, people were modding these PCB boards, right? And
or
so you'd see
bootlegging, right? So it's often known.
or bootlegging, yeah. So yeah, I should use the term that we used back then was like bootlegging, right? So you would take the PCB board and you do a whole load of changes to it, and you would have like the ability, and this is actually where the combo system, my understanding, came from originally in Street Fighter, in Super Street Fighter 2, was that people were modding bootleg versions of these games and changing the mechanics, right?
And it's worth noting that these weren't necessarily fans doing this. This was pirates, often within Asia, and they were doing it as ways of like extending the gameplay, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know the deep history in terms of like all of the rationales behind it, but I mean, it's you know, the average player back then didn't have access to do a lot of these mods, so it's quite technical people who were doing it, and yes, it would have most likely been people who were modding it for their particular arcade, because they wanted to keep people interested in the game, and especially if you've got a game that's in there for a while and you can't swap it out, like if you can modify it in some way to make it more interesting. Like I remember seeing in chip shops like versions of Street Fighter 2s where you can fill the full screen with like sonic booms, right? Like those are the type of editions. I think there's one called like Street Fighter 2 Rainbow Edition.
Yeah, Rainbow's the famous one, right? Yeah. And that's the ability to like play M. Bison for the first time and like Turbo.
Yeah,
faster, right?
It's faster. They've made all these modifications. A lot of those gameplay mechanics ended up being like implemented into some of these later games, right? There's clear like inspiration from that. And so for me, having that mindset, seeing X-Men, and it's just so now it's not alien to us, but thinking of like, why is X-Men and Street Fighter together? This doesn't make any sense. I thought it was like some type of like bootleg when it first came out. And I remember my brother saying like, no, this is legit. And, you know, the idea of crossing the streams back then was really like, it was fun. It was like novel. It was like interesting. It was cool. And, you know, even I would say it was still cool, you know, combining IPs up until maybe 10 years ago when you first had maybe Fortnite and you'd have like the first IP integration there, like that was still considered like fun, at least at that scale. I mean, obviously there's been other games between then and now, but
I want to stay on this point. I want to explore this point actually, because it's not something I thought about in the research, but it's this idea of like the way that these bootlegging companies were sort of forcing upon Capcom, because really this sort of this bootlegging became quite popular around Street Fighter, was the idea that this was a game that people were playing at great depth, but they started to get bored of it, and then these bootleggers were not only just because they could easily just climb the board and then resell you the board, right? Because I don't think they were selling necessarily the EEPROM or the ROM sets, but they were completely recreating the boards, the
entire board.
Yeah, and things with like Rainbow, where they're like, okay, we're not just going to do it. We're going to give you something extra that will pull players away from legitimate arcades that are using legitimate boards, because this game's faster. This game lets you play M. Bison. It lets you do all these different things. Yeah, and then also I guess that kind of like triggered in my brain that you would see like with Famicom or Famiclone carts, you would see things like Sonic. Like, you know, you would see sprite swaps of Mario with Sonic, and then vice versa, and you would get these sort of like, you end up with this horrible bootleg version of Mario on a Mega Drive cartridge, and it felt kind of wrong. So I'm guessing like these sort of the idea of these crossover things was probably being forced from a kind of like illegitimate angle, and I wonder how much that kind of impacted the thinking for Capcom, because it certainly impacted them to go to the Turbo Street Fighter. I think was inspired by these bootleg games, which was extending the gameplay. Are they also asking this question where they're getting these kind of like these ROM swaps, where they're the sort of sprite swaps that are having these additional characters in? Super fascinating. I guess like we will never know for certain, but
we'll never know because they'll never officially ever say, yeah, and we were inspired by like this ROM hack. In the same way how you have developers now who are clearly inspired by like indie titles or mods, like, you know, I won't name it, but like there are full games that will re-release as a Game of the Year edition, and it includes is mods from the community, right? So this isn't new, and I feel like it's not. I wouldn't be surprised if Capcom were absolutely, you know, they were most likely inspired by what the wider, it's hard to say the community, what the arcade owners were doing to some of their games, but the idea of it legitimizing crossovers, I guess they felt confident at some point to then say like, we're going to make this into a thing. It's going to be, you know, we'll test the waters with X-Men and Street Fighter. And then it becomes not just X-Men, it's Marvel versus Street Fighter. And then, okay, it's not just Street Fighter now, it's Capcom. And then like now, you get to the point in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 where you've got Jill from Resident Evil and
Trombone
from Mega Man Legends,
Yeah.
And Serverbot and Morrigan from Darkstalkers, and just like the most random things. And then vs. Capcom 1 had even almost zanier editions of people like Michelle Hart, which was like some random Capcom character that was maybe in some shmup or something. But I guess this all plays into like, the legacy of the game, right? In terms of what did it do in terms of legitimizing not just, I mean, we focus quite heavily on the idea of IP collaboration, but I think a big part of it is quality license games and the license and the IP holder actually almost holding the developer to account in the use of their IP.
But as I understand Marvel were kind of in a bit of a way when this happened.
Yeah, they were about to go bankrupt.
We didn't really cover it. So it seems that actually Capcom got, good rights and got it reasonably cheaply to have the ability to do this. And I guess I was wondering if it was almost that they were given a lot of freedom, but you seem to think it was so I assume the quality of this game was about Capcom being given the freedom, getting the license at a reasonable price, and that giving them enough time and money and effort to be able to do a good job of this. But maybe it's a little bit more. You think actually it was just a lot of the quality was driven by Marvel?
I mean, it's not to suggest that the quality wasn't driven by Capcom, but I think the fact was that they wanted to get it right and they wanted to get these characters right. And there was clearly, for whatever reason, there was clearly a lot riding on it from all camps, right? And Marvel were really particular about how their characters looked and how they reacted in the world and if everything, looked right and sounded right. So I would say it was hand in hand in that you had these amazing pixel artists and designers. You have people like Akiman doing these, beautiful designs as he always does, and then trying to recreate that with the power that they had at the time, because CPS2 was relatively quite powerful. It did allow them to be creative, it did, but they had to do it under the guise of licensing. And anyone who's ever worked, and I'm sure you may have worked on some licensed properties, like, how difficult,
including Marvel licenses. Yeah, the first games were Marvel licenses. Yeah. Well, actually, interesting. Actually, one of the very first games I worked on in my career was Mario Sonic at the Olympic Games.
Crossover game.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that was before it was announced. My very first job in the industry was QA at Sega, and one of the first projects was, you're going to be working on a Wii game, which is Mario and Sonic in it together. And I was like, I know, but really, what am I doing? I thought it was, it was a prank. The very idea of that, as somebody that grew up in the great console wars, they say my generation didn't live for a war, but they obviously.
We're not counting video game wars.
Yeah, nobody knew how feisty it got between Sega and Nintendo. The idea that those two very big rivals were all of a sudden, church and state were, but it also probably that spoke more to the downfall of Sega than anything.
What we've got to mention is the fact that like Capcom had an insane amount of output during those years. They launched in 1994 with this game. Pretty much every year after that point, they launched a new game, and it wasn't just like a new game with a couple of changes. It was going from, a one-on-one tighter fighting game to a 2v2 fighting game, then to a 3v3 fighting game that has like 3D backgrounds and polygonal artwork. Like, it's a huge jump in terms of like what that team was doing. So I think it's always worth kind of flagging that in terms of what they did since then. And we could spend just as long as we already have speaking about X-Men vs. Street Fighter, speaking about Marvel vs. Capcom and Marvel vs. Capcom 2. We could spend an age. We are not going to do that. I think it's also worth highlighting some of the other licensed fighting games that they had around the time. And so, like, X-Men was one of the earliest ones. Dragon Ball Z, Super Butoden on the Super Nintendo was, some people still rate it as like a good fighting game. But that's an early licensed game, and it was okay. Tournament Fighters was also okay. That was Turtles fighting game. And then we had X-Men Children of the Atom, and then a whole load of games after that. I kind of mentioned this Gundam, the Battle Master game earlier. There was a Kung Fu game with Jackie Chan as well. So licensed fighting games, I felt at least there was a little bit more legitimacy around it and the likelihood of that it could be, it could be pretty good. Now, in terms of other inspirations, like after that, there's a lot of kind of crossover style games. A lot of times it's crossovers within its own world, so not really going outside of that game world. So Fighters Mega Mix is an obvious one, which for those who don't know, that was from Sega, but essentially it was Virtua Fighter, Fighting Vipers, and a lot of other Sega IPs. So you could play as the car from Daytona.
Yeah,
you could play as one of the Sonic characters, all of that. Energize, which was a fighting game that was from, at the time, was just known as Square, that had some guest characters from Final Fantasy. So I think Cloud and Sephiroth are in that one.
Right, yeah.
Big one, which I feel like this absolutely inspires, Smash Brothers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Like a collection of Nintendo IPs. Sega Gaga. There we go. Talk about Dreamcast.
We've not mentioned, or it's not in your notes, Def Jam, Battle for New York,
Jam.
is it? In there?
Yeah. Def Jam, Fight for New York. And then there were obviously third-party IP crossovers. We mentioned Battletoads, Double Dragon. There's Dream Mix, which is like mostly Nintendo-only series of games that does have a lot of crossovers. Then we have things like Jump, Superstars, which is Shonen Jump characters. So if you're Shonen characters like Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, One Piece. Dengeki Bunko Fighting Climax is a more recent one that has mixes Sega IP and anime like Sword Art Online and other things like that. And then we have like, well, the last 8 years of just constant crossovers. You have games like Fall Guys, Minecraft, anything these days has a crossover in it. Even Helldivers I saw has a crossover.
And I guess we've sort of renamed it sometimes as Metaverse as well, right?
Not in my house, but yes. Yeah, some people do call this a metaverse, but it's really just an IP crossover, and typically someone's getting paid for this.
Right.
In some form or fashion.
DC also had their own fighting game, which was called Metaverses, wasn't it? Which was a play on that idea.
Correct. Yeah, that was kind of similar like a Smash Brothers game. But there's been DC versus Mortal Kombat. It wasn't just Marvel who was getting in on it. DC clearly wanted to get in this at some point. Yeah, a lot of crossovers. I feel like it all starts with X-Men on the Atom. And this is why I considered this at the point of us having this podcast today.
It's also, I completely forgotten this game was Wu-Tang Shaolin. Oh, Taste the Pain? Wu-Tang Taste the Pain? Shaolin Star? There were
Wu-Tang Taste the Pain.
Yeah, there were a couple of video games, weren't there? And also infamous for having the Wu W controller. You've seen the controller, right?
I only really know that game because that game is based off another game called Thrill Kill, which then they reskinned. So I think Thrill Kill ended up, I think they finished it, but it didn't pass, I don't know, the certifications at the time. So they ended up reskinning it and calling it this Wu-Tang game.
So you've never seen the Wu controller? The Wu W shape?
I think I have seen it. Okay, I have seen it, but I wouldn't consider that to be that controversial.
No, I remember when I used to work in Game, which is the UK equivalent of GameStop, that one of those was traded in. It was just sat in a basket for I don't want to look it up on eBay because I'm a Wu-Tang fan. I'd hate to know. They probably are crazy money now. Not a very good controller, very cheap. Like a lot of things to do with the Wu-Tang. Just know if you're not putting out particularly good merchandise, right? Yeah. There's always something on ASOS or Boohoo with a Wu-Tang logo on it. So, Wayne, I think this sort of gets us to the end of talking about the legacy. And with this game, and the debate that me and you had about it, I think, was not necessarily about whether or not we should talk about this series. It was about which game that we chose. And for me, I think this game is probably a little bit too early, but it's a nexus, really. It's the first flashpoint of this idea of Marvel going and leading into this metaverse IP crossover, whatever we want to call it. And really the first time that two companies rather than two IPs or one company putting these multiple IPs together, because it goes all the way back to Sega doing it with Alex Kidd and Shinobi is probably the first instance we could find, which is 1990. But about really two companies that collaborate and bring their IPs together and trust each other to do it, and it happening in games, and then that going on to be a kind of it's to be something that's quite major and still plays a part. And if you talk about Fortnite, just how big that is now, the idea that if you launch a movie, you're taking it to Fortnite, right? And you want the Fortnite skin. Recently, the Fantastic Four, maybe there were Fantastic Four skins in the Fortnite game. Do you have a Fantastic Four skin, or you don't have one? I do not. You don't have one. I didn't pick one up either. And so that idea is like, it's so prevalent now. It's become so important. So whether this is the game, but what it represents is, and this is unusual for us because when we normally talk about games and games of no, Warrenville was really important. It did that thing, and it was the first thing to do that, and it was very clear. And the same with Dear Esther. Lots of it, Shenmue. There's things that we can very clearly say this was the first thing doing this, but this is like a sort of toe in the water, right, towards this great thing which would evolve and emerge, which is often the case in game design or within the games industry. It's not one hit game that comes out of nowhere. It's a building on lots of ideas, and then at some point somebody cracks it.
I guess for me that the easier podcast we could have done or episode could have been on Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And I felt that though, that would have been a disservice because we would have had to go back and talk about, well, where does this all come from? Like this all comes from this game. You don't get to Marvel vs. Capcom 2 without Expansion of the Atom. Now, is Marvel vs. Capcom 2, it's clearly more beloved. It's clearly more successful, but is it the more important title? I mean, this is my thesis, is that I think this game that we're talking about is the more important game and is more notable for what it did and what it allowed to come after it. Obviously, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 had a greater impact, still being played today and is still regarded as a top tier fighter. But for me, I just felt like we would be missing a trick by not really talking about the origins of this collaboration and really all good, legitimate IP collaborations going forward.
So that kind of brings us on to should you play it now? And this is where we probably diverge the most because I've seen the notes and you've only got one word under this. Should you play it now, Wayne?
So, I mean, I think so. I mean, from my perspective, I think it feels the most grounded despite it being crazy and over the top. It feels the most like tight-knit style of a game. Like if you want to play a game where you are playing as X-Men characters and you can really utilize their powers, I think this game showcases that off perfectly. I think it is a solid fighting game. I think it still holds up. I think it still looks amazing. I think it still sounds amazing. And it is still really accessible. Well, now it's more accessible than it used to be because it got recently re-released as part of the Marvel vs. Capcom collection. So you can play this now. And you're lucky in the fact that even if you don't agree with me in this being like particularly notable, you get a whole collection of those games you get from this initial game all the way to Marvel vs. Capcom 2 in that one collection. So for me, if you are going to play it, and even if you only really want to play Marvel vs. Capcom 2, you'll get access to that in this version. So for me, I think it's absolutely is something that you should play now.
So yeah, in your notes it just says yes exclamation mark, and then directly under that I've said no. I think if you are going to play, if you're new to fighters and you've not ever played any 2D fighter or anything from the mainstream Street Fighter, probably this is not the one to start with. I would actually, and as a casual player, someone that's sunk the most time in any fighter into Marvel vs. Capcom 2, I think even though this game feels tighter and it feels neater for me as a layman, not necessarily someone that's going deep, and it feels more cohesive visually and mechanically. There's an expanded moveset in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. There's more going on. It's flashy. There's stuff happening. It's probably in some ways more accessible because of the fact that it's maybe a little bit more friendly to button mashing. This game, I think, I found it really hard as someone that's not a particularly great fighter. And I found it really difficult to get past stage 2 or 3, even credit feeding. And I went away and I had a little look and the feeling was for a lot of people that there was a lot of like cheapness from the AI and there was a lot of input reading. So I think in that regard, it can feel like it's a real coin muncher. Whereas Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is much more generous with its time, with its credits, right? And I think that as a casual player, you'll get more out of Marvel vs. Capcom 2. But I can appreciate this as someone that if I was better at fighters and I was willing to sit down and put the time in, I might actually get more out of this game. But I'm not. But if you are that person and you've already played Marvel vs. Capcom, and then you went and played Marvel vs. Capcom 1 because you couldn't get enough of it, and then you went off and you played Capcom vs. SNK 2, and then you went to SNK versus Capcom Chaos, and then you were like, oh, that's way too techie for me, and then you bounced back. And then you went and played Marvel vs. Capcom 3 Infinite, and you're like, oh, this isn't that good. And then then you had a quick go on X-Men versus Street Fighter 2. And you thought, I'll have a go on this one. Yeah, I think it's probably, for me, it's sort of like if you're exploring that franchise,
yes,
there's a lot of places to go, and I probably wouldn't start at this one. But I think I can see and appreciate that it is very clean, and it feels like it was I guess maybe the game designer and game developer in me, I feel that it feels like it was fresh and it had been built from the ground up in a way that Marvel vs. Capcom 2 doesn't. That feels like a kit bash.
Yes.
People talk about
which it kind of is.
Yeah, and people talk about asset flips on, which is the idea of you go to the Unity asset store and you buy lots of different assets from different packs and you make a game around it and then you push out. That's basically what Marvel vs. Capcom does. And I guess it's probably a little bit more like Goat Simulator, right? In the sense of like it's janky. But you're telling me that actually, even though that's on the surface level, that mechanically it's way less cheesy and more balanced, right?
Yeah. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is considered way more balanced than Expansion of the Atom, because Expansion of the Atom was experimenting with a lot of these things that they didn't quite realize, like, if we give this character... I mean, like, just the other day, I was learning about Omega Red. He can, like, do almost infinite dashes after he does a particular move in the air. Like, that's broken. Like, that's straight up broken. That shouldn't be possible. But that was because this was all new. Like, they were experimenting. But I think what you've said is absolutely valid. It's interesting because for me, it feels like this should be the game that someone should start off with, because you can just choose maybe the character that you're the most interested in and just muck around with them, as opposed to having to learn 3 characters in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. But I understand the point you're making.
Nice. Okay, that kind of takes us to the end, Wayne, of games of note. And this one I think has probably been a little bit longer. Hopefully it's been somewhat tight. It's also worth noticing the reason that we've not made one in some time is because I've been quite busy making a game. And Wayne, you've been helping me on that as well.
A little?
Yes, quite a lot.
Yeah, so I guess it's worth us saying that we haven't been able to, unfortunately, get podcasts out. However, we still have this in the back of our minds, and we're always keen to always chat. So that, hopefully you will see a new episode sometime soon in the future. But yeah, it's been really good chatting, Will.
Yeah, you claimed you met a fan, and that was what inspired you to Games of Note fan. The fan?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Okay.
I met a fan. Well, and someone who we kind of know in the industry, who said that they really enjoyed the podcast. And actually, I got another message from someone who said, like, they showed me, and I'll share it with you. Their most listened to podcast this year was our podcast.
On Spotify Wrapped?
I thought, yeah, I guess it must have been on Spotify Wrapped. Yeah, so that made me feel good.
I mean, we've only done about 5 hours of podcasting, so it really is...
Well, this person clearly didn't. Yeah, well. But, I mean, this podcast in itself is, an hour or more?
Yes.
So we'll see how we go.
Brilliant.
Games of Note.